The Shadow in the Well. The small village of Briar Hollow had many legends, but none as feared as the tale of the old stone well on the outskirts of town. It was said to be cursed, a place where people vanished, never to be seen again. The well sat forgotten at the edge of the woods, its stones crumbling, the rope that once held the bucket frayed and rotting. Villagers would warn their children to stay away, to never peer into its depths. But, as with all dark tales, not everyone believed. Megan didn't believe. She had just moved to Briar Hollow, a city girl who scoffed at small-town superstitions. She had taken a job as a teacher in the local school and was renting a small cottage on the edge of the village, close to the woods where the well stood. The villagers had warned her repeatedly, but she found the warnings quaint, if not a little amusing. A cursed well? How could people still believe such nonsense? It was a cool autumn evening when Megan decided to explore the woods near her cottage. The air was crisp, the leaves crunched beneath her feet, and the setting sun bathed the forest in a soft golden glow. As she wandered deeper into the woods, she found herself near the infamous well. It was smaller than she had imagined, barely visible under a tangle of vines and overgrown weeds. Smirking to herself, she approached the well, her curiosity piqued. The villagers had said that at night, shadows danced around the well, and if you looked into its depths, something might look back. Ridiculous, she thought. Megan brushed away the vines and peered into the well. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. She squinted, leaning in a little closer, but still, nothing. A soft wind stirred the leaves around her, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint whisper rising from the well's depths. She shook her head, laughing at herself. Then she saw it. A shadow, faint at first, but as she watched, it grew more distinct, more solid. It moved slowly, shifting and writhing as though it were alive. Megan blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, there was something down there. Suddenly, a voice, soft and raspy, drifted up from the well. "Help! Me!" Megan gasped, stumbling back from the well. Her heart raced as she looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, nearby. But she was alone. The voice came again, weak and pitiful. "Please, help me." Against every instinct screaming in her mind to run, Megan stepped closer to the well. "Who's down there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was a long silence, then the voice replied, "I've been trapped for so long. Please, help me. I'm so cold." Megan's stomach twisted. Could someone have fallen into the well? How long had they been down there? She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the well. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only rough stones and damp earth. The voice came again, softer now. "Please, don't leave me here." Megan swallowed hard. She knew it was a bad idea, but the voice sounded so desperate, so human. She grabbed an old rope that had been lying near the well, tied it to a sturdy tree, and lowered the end into the darkness. "Grab on!" she called out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the rope began to tug. Megan's heart raced as she braced herself, pulling with all her strength. The rope was heavy, far heavier than she expected. Whatever was down there was slowly coming up, hand over hand, climbing toward the surface. The air grew colder, unnaturally cold, and the wind began to howl through the trees. Megan shivered, her breath visible in the sudden chill. As the weight on the rope grew heavier, she gritted her teeth and kept pulling, though her arms were aching. And then, something came into view. A hand, long, thin, and dark, like a shadow made flesh, grasped the edge of the well. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hand was wrong. It wasn't human. It was twisted and gnarled, the fingers too long, the nails sharp like claws. Before she could react, the creature pulled itself up and out of the well. It was a shadow, but solid, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Its face was a void, featureless, except for two glowing eyes that burned with an unnatural light. It stood before her, towering over her, its presence suffocating. The air around them seemed to hum with a dark energy, and Megan felt her legs turn to jelly. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body was frozen in place. "Thank you," the creature whispered, its voice a twisted parody of the one she had heard before. "You have freed me." Megan's throat tightened as terror overwhelmed her. She turned to flee, but the creature was faster. It moved like a wisp of smoke, wrapping around her before she could take another step. Cold fingers closed around her wrist, and she screamed as the shadow's grip tightened. "Now, you will take my place." With those words, the world around Megan seemed to tilt. The trees, the ground, the sky, they all faded into darkness, and she felt herself being pulled, dragged down into the well's endless depths. She clawed at the earth, screamed for help, but it was no use. The shadow was relentless, pulling her into the cold, suffocating darkness below. The last thing she saw before the well swallowed her whole was the creature, now free, standing in the moonlight. It looked down at her with glowing eyes, its twisted grin the only thing visible in the dark. And then she was gone. The villagers noticed Megan's disappearance a few days later. They searched the woods, the fields, and even the well, but there was no sign of her. The well remained as it always had, quiet and forgotten, with no clues to her fate. But sometimes, on cold, still nights, if you stand near the well, you might hear a voice, faint and distant, barely more than a whisper. "Help. Me." But no one dares to look into the well. Not anymore. The house at the end of Hollow Lane. It was said that the house at the end of Hollow Lane had a mind of its own. The locals called it the living house, a place where time seemed to warp and twist, and where people went in but rarely came out. Stories of its shifting halls and ghostly inhabitants had been whispered around campfires for years, but no one had lived there for decades. That is, until Lily moved in. Lily had never been one to believe in ghost stories. After losing her job in the city, she needed a fresh start, and the old house had come at a price she couldn't resist. It was bigger than anything she could have afforded otherwise, and though it was in disrepair, she saw it as a project, a new beginning. The town's warnings didn't deter her. To her, it was just another old, creaky house that needed a little love. The first few days passed without incident. Lily spent her time cleaning and making the place livable. It was exhausting work, but she enjoyed the solitude. Hollow Lane was far from town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow up all sound. The house itself was old and filled with hidden nooks and crannies, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and creaking floorboards. Every once in a while, she thought she heard faint footsteps coming from the upstairs rooms, but she brushed it off as the house settling. Then, one evening, something changed. It had been a long day of scrubbing and dusting, and Lily was relaxing in the living room with a cup of tea when she noticed something odd. The doorway to the hall seemed different. It was wider than she remembered, and the wallpaper, which had been yellow and peeling, now looked fresher, cleaner. She frowned, setting her cup down and walking over to inspect it. Had she just not noticed before? Maybe she was more tired than she thought. She turned to head back to the living room, but froze. The living room was gone. In its place was a long, narrow hallway, stretching far beyond where the living room should have been. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, a dim light flickering from the room beyond. Lily's heart raced. This wasn't possible. She had just been sitting in the living room. Panic set in as she backed away, her eyes darting around. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick and heavy. She turned and ran back towards the front door, but as she reached for the handle, it wasn't there. The door was gone, replaced by another hallway that twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Breathing hard, Lily tried to calm herself. This couldn't be real. She must be hallucinating. Maybe she was overtired, dehydrated. She needed to find her way back to the stairs, to get to the second floor where her bedroom was. Maybe everything would be normal upstairs. But the house had other plans. As she moved through the hallways, they shifted around her. Rooms appeared and disappeared. One moment, she'd find herself in what seemed like the dining room, but the next, the walls would stretch and twist, pulling her into a space that hadn't existed a second before. The house was alive, changing itself around her, trapping her within its maze-like corridors. And then she started hearing them, the voices. At first they were faint, little more than whispers carried on the air. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, clearer. They called her name over and over, sometimes soft, sometimes pleading, sometimes sharp and angry. "Lily!" She spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one. The voices echoed from everywhere and nowhere, filling her mind. Her pulse quickened as her fear deepened. The house was playing with her, toying with her panic. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time no longer made sense in the house. Every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into its shifting, labyrinthine halls. Her legs ached, her throat was dry, and her head pounded with fear and confusion. Then she saw it. A door. It was different from the others, larger and made of dark wood, with a strange, ornate symbol carved into it. Something about it felt wrong, but she couldn't resist. This was the first door that hadn't disappeared or changed the moment she reached for it. Desperation overtook her, and she grabbed the handle, twisting it open. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single candle that flickered on a table in the center. But it wasn't the candle that drew her attention. It was the figure seated at the table, their back turned to her. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as the figure slowly turned. It was an old woman, her skin pale and drawn tight over her bones, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She smiled at Lily, a twisted, eerie grin that sent chills down her spine. The woman's lips moved, but her voice came from all around Lily, like the house itself was speaking. "You shouldn't have come here, child." Lily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. Who are you?" The old woman's smile widened. "This house. It's hungry. Always hungry." Lily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I just wanted to live here," she stammered. "I didn't know." The woman cackled, the sound harsh and grating. "The house chooses who stays, and it's chosen you." Suddenly, the walls of the room began to close in, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The air grew colder, and Lily felt something wrap around her ankles, roots, dark and gnarled, creeping up from the floorboards. She tried to pull away, but they held fast, tightening with every second. The old woman stood, her form dissolving into shadow as she moved closer. "You'll feed the house, just like the others. You'll become part of it." Lily's screams echoed through the halls, but no one was there to hear them. The roots pulled her down, deeper into the floor, the house devouring her piece by piece. The last thing she saw was the old woman's face, twisted in a grotesque smile, as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then there was silence. Days later, the townspeople noticed that Lily had stopped coming into town. No one dared go to the house at the end of Hollow Lane, but they knew. The house had claimed another, and it was always hungry for more, the watcher in the window. The small town of Green Hollow was quiet, unremarkable, and peaceful, until the strange occurrences began at 54 Maple Street. It was an old Victorian home, abandoned for years, sitting near the edge of town. The locals had plenty of tales about it. Stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises in the night, and lights flickering in the windows long after the last resident left. But these stories were mostly forgotten, swept aside by time and the town's unwillingness to dwell on the past. That is, until the Myers family moved in. Sarah Myers was excited for the change. After a grueling divorce, she had bought the house at a steal, eager to start fresh with her 9-year-old son, Danny. The house needed work, but it had a certain charm, and Sarah was determined to make it their new home. The first few days were uneventful. Sarah spent her time unpacking, while Danny explored the house, fascinated by the old architecture and the creaky wooden floors. But it wasn't long before things took a turn. It started with the feeling of being watched. Sarah would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow in the hallway, a flicker in the mirror, only to turn and find nothing. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, blaming it on stress and exhaustion. But Danny noticed it too. "Mum," he said one night after dinner, "I keep seeing someone watching me from the window." Sarah paused, her fork hovering above her plate. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Danny pointed to the large window in the living room, his face pale. "From that window, there's a man. He's always staring at me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the window, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty, just the darkened backyard beyond the glass. "There's no one there, Danny," she said, trying to reassure him, and herself. "It's just your imagination." But Danny was adamant. "He's there, Mom, every night, watching." Sarah didn't know what to make of it. She didn't want to scare Danny, but the thought of someone or something watching her son was unsettling. She started checking the locks on the doors and windows every night, making sure the house was secure. But the feeling of being watched never left. Then came the whispers. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Sarah began to hear faint voices. They were soft, barely audible, like a distant conversation she couldn't quite make out. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes in the house, groaning. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was speaking directly to her from the shadows. One night, Sarah was jolted awake by a sound, a loud thud from downstairs. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and quietly made her way down the creaky stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. As she stepped into the living room, her eyes were drawn to the window Danny had mentioned. There, standing just outside, was a shadowy figure, a man, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes never leaving hers. Suddenly, there was a crash from upstairs. Sarah spun around, rushing up the stairs to Danny's room. She flung open the door, her heart in her throat. Danny was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and pale, pointing to the window. "He's here, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's inside." Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned to the window, and there, standing just beyond the glass, was the same shadowy figure. But this time, he was inside the house, watching them both. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Danny and ran. They fled the house, not stopping until they were safely inside a neighbor's home. The police arrived, but found no sign of an intruder. No footprints, no broken windows, nothing. But Sarah knew what she had seen. and so did Danny. They never went back to 54 Maple Street. The house still stands there, empty once more, but locals say that if you walk by late at night, you can see the shadowy figure standing in the window, watching, always watching. The Forgotten Room. The Williams family had just moved into their dream home, a sprawling old manor on the outskirts of town. It was a fixer-upper, but it had character, history, and enough space for their growing family. Mark and Beth Williams were excited to raise their 2 kids, Ella and Jack, in the grand old house. But there was something strange about the house, something that had been overlooked during the purchase. It wasn't mentioned in the listing, and none of the previous owners had brought it up. It was a room that didn't appear on any floor plan or blueprint of the house. It was Jack who found it. One afternoon, as the family was unpacking boxes, 7-year-old Jack came running down the stairs, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, Dad, I found a secret room." Mark and Beth exchanged puzzled glances. "A secret room?" Beth asked, following Jack upstairs. Jack led them to the far end of the second floor, to a small hallway they hadn't explored yet. At the end of the hall was an old wooden door, slightly ajar. Beth frowned. They had already walked through the entire house, but she didn't remember this door. Curious, they opened the door and stepped inside. It was a small, dusty room with no windows, tucked away in the corner of the house. The air was stale, and the room smelled of mildew and decay. It was completely empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room, facing the far wall. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. "That's strange," Mark muttered, inspecting the room. This wasn't on the floor plan. Beth shivered. There was something unsettling about the room, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It felt wrong. They didn't think much of it at first. It was just an old, forgotten room, hidden away in a house that had seen better days. But that night, the nightmares began. Ella woke up screaming, saying she had seen a man standing at the foot of her bed, his face twisted and grotesque. Jack refused to sleep in his room, saying the voices in the walls kept whispering his name. And Beth began to feel it too, that strange, oppressive presence that seemed to emanate from the forgotten room. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the temperature in the house suddenly dropped. The lights flickered, and the air became thick and heavy. Mark and Beth exchanged nervous glances. Something wasn't right. Then, from upstairs, they heard it, a slow, creaking sound, like someone walking across the floor. Mark grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way upstairs. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the forgotten room. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, pulling it open. The room was empty, but as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The chair in the center of the room, was facing the opposite direction, as if someone had moved it. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't touched the chair. No one had. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Mark spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The temperature in the room dropped further, and the walls seemed to close in on him. From the shadows, he heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "Get out!" Mark didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, the family packed their bags and left the house. They never returned, leaving the forgotten room and whatever lurked inside it, undisturbed. The house remains abandoned to this day, but locals say that if you stand outside late at night, you can sometimes hear the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, as if something or someone is still moving it. waiting for the next family to come. And the whispers never stop. The whispers beneath Ravenswood Bridge. There was something unsettling about Ravenswood Bridge, a decaying iron structure that arched over a narrow ravine just outside the town of Hallow Creek. The bridge had stood for over a century, weathered by time and neglect, but it had long since been abandoned. The road leading to it was overgrown with weeds, and most of the townfolk stayed far away. Stories about the bridge had circulated for decades, stories of strange sounds and eerie whispers that seemed to come from beneath the water below. Lydia hadn't given much thought to the tales. She was a journalist, always chasing the next big story, and folklore wasn't her area of interest. But when her editor sent her to cover the unexplained disappearances of 2 teenagers near Ravenswood Bridge, her curiosity was piqued. Local authorities had no leads. The teens had been last seen on their way to the bridge, but no one had heard from them since. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. Determined to find answers, Lydia drove out to Ravenswood on a chilly autumn afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting a pale, ghostly light over the desolate landscape. The trees around the ravine were bare, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as she approached the bridge. Lydia parked her car a few hundred yards away and walked the rest of the distance. Her footsteps echoed eerily on the cracked asphalt as she crossed the bridge. The old iron structure groaned beneath her weight. The sound of the wind, whistling through the rusted beams, sent a shiver down her spine. The ravine below was narrow and dark, filled with stagnant water that barely moved. As Lydia peered over the edge, she felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching her. She shook it off, reminding herself that she was alone. There was no one here, just the wind and the trees. And yet, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely discernible over the rustling leaves. Lydia paused, her heart skipping a beat. The sound wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from beneath the bridge. She crouched down, leaning over the edge, listening closely. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, but still too muffled to make out any words. It was as though voices were drifting up from the water below, soft, insistent, calling to her. Lydia's pulse quickened. She pulled out her phone, turning on the voice recorder. Maybe this was the story she had come for, the strange whispers people had spoken about for years. But as the voices grew louder, more distinct, an icy fear crept into her chest. Lydia! The voice, faint but unmistakable, rose from beneath the bridge. Her own name, spoken in a hoarse whisper, sent a shock of terror through her. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. How did they know her name? Was someone down there? She scanned the ravine, but there was no sign of anyone. The water below was still and black, as if it had never been disturbed. Yet the whispers continued, growing louder and more frenzied. Lydia, come closer. Against her better judgment, she found herself drawn to the edge once again. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to turn and run back to her car, but something, some force she couldn't explain, pulled her in. She leaned over the side, peering down into the murky water. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. Then, out of the darkness, something moved. A pale, ghostly hand emerged from the water, followed by another, then another. One by one, the hands reached up, grasping at the sides of the ravine, pulling themselves toward the bridge. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror. They were not human. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over long, bony limbs. Their faces were twisted, featureless, except for gaping mouths that opened wide, releasing a chorus of terrible wailing cries. They crawled up the sides of the ravine, their hands grasping the edges of the bridge, pulling themselves onto the rusted iron beams. Lydia backed away, her mind reeling. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. The creatures, whatever they were coming for her. Suddenly one of them lunged, its long skeletal fingers wrapping around her ankle. Lydia screamed, stumbling backward, but the creature held tight, its grip like ice. More hands reached for her, pulling her toward the edge of the bridge. "No!" she cried, struggling to free herself. But it was no use. The creatures were too strong. Their whispers filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts, pulling her into the darkness. As they dragged her to the edge, Lydia caught one last glimpse of the sky, grey and lifeless, before she was pulled beneath the surface of the water. And then there was silence. Days later, a search party was sent to Ravenswood Bridge. They found Lydia's car, but there was no sign of her. Just like the others, she had vanished without a trace. But if you stand on the bridge at night, you can still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, calling from beneath the water, and they know your name. The collector of lost souls. There was a house deep in the forest, hidden away from prying eyes and forgotten by time. No one in the nearby town spoke of it, but the stories lingered in whispers, stories of people who entered the house but never returned. The house was said to belong to a man, a strange figure who collected more than just trinkets and artifacts. They called him the Collector. Nathan didn't believe in such nonsense. A pragmatic and somewhat jaded man in his early 30s, Nathan had inherited a small cabin not far from the forest after his grandfather passed away. The cabin, nestled in the woods, was peaceful, until Nathan stumbled upon an old map tucked away in one of his grandfather's books. The map led to a spot deep in the woods, marked with a strange symbol. Intrigued, Nathan decided to follow it. It was a chilly afternoon when Nathan ventured into the dense forest, armed with nothing but a flashlight and his curiosity. The deeper he went, the darker and quieter the woods became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their twisted branches like grasping fingers. After what felt like hours, he finally found it. The house. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its dark wooden exterior weathered and covered in ivy. The windows were black, empty, like the eyes of a long-dead corpse. The front door was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for him. Nathan hesitated. Something about the house made his skin crawl. It felt wrong, as if the air around it was thick with something unseen, something unnatural. But he shook off his unease. It was just an old house. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and musty, filled with the scent of rot and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he entered the main hall. The interior was surprisingly well kept, with antique furniture lining the walls, and old paintings hanging crookedly from the walls. But what caught his attention were the shelves. They were everywhere, lining every wall, filled with strange objects, old photographs, broken toys, rusted keys, cracked mirrors. Each object seemed out of place, as though it had been taken from another time, another life. Nathan wandered through the house, examining the strange collection. As he moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew heavier. He reached a door at the end of the hall, larger and more ornate than the others. His hand hesitated on the handle, but curiosity got the better of him. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was dark, save for a single, flickering candle in the center of the room. In its dim light, Nathan saw what filled the shelves here. Jars. Dozens of glass jars, each filled with a swirling grey mist that seemed to pulse with life. Nathan frowned, stepping closer. As he peered into one of the jars, he saw something moving inside. A face, a human face, distorted and twisted in silent agony, floated within the mist, its mouth open in a soundless scream. Nathan stumbled back in horror. These weren't just objects. These were souls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and a voice, deep and hollow, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come here!" Nathan spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall man dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and black, as though they had never known light. He smiled, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "I am the collector," the man said, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "And you are my next addition." Nathan backed away, his mind racing. What are you?" The collector's smile widened. "I collect the lost, the souls of those who wander too far, who stray from the path. They become mine, forever trapped, forever part of my collection." Nathan's breath quickened. He had to get out, had to escape. But as he turned to run, the collector raised a hand, and the air around Nathan thickened, as though invisible hands were gripping him, pulling him toward the shelves. "No!" Nathan screamed, struggling against the force, but it was too late. His body froze, and the world around him darkened. His mind slipped away, lost in a swirl of grey mist. The last thing he saw was the collector's cold, black eyes, watching him with cruel delight. When the sun rose the next morning, the house stood empty once more, waiting for the next lost soul to wander inside. And on the shelf, in a small glass jar, a new face appeared, its mouth open in a silent scream. It was called Blackthorne Manor, a crumbling estate that had once been the crown jewel of the countryside, now reduced to little more than a haunting relic of a dark past. For over a century, the house had been abandoned, standing like a silent sentinel on the edge of the village. The locals avoided it at all costs, whispering of the curse that had fallen upon the Blackthorne family, whose name had become synonymous with tragedy and death. But Rebecca wasn't one to believe in curses. As an ambitious historian, with a passion for uncovering the truth behind old legends, Rebecca was drawn to Blackthorne Manor like a moth to a flame. The story of the Manor intrigued her. The once powerful Blackthorne family had mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving behind nothing but whispers of dark magic and death. Some said the manor was haunted, that the souls of the Blackthornes still lingered within its decaying walls. Others claimed the house itself was cursed to bring ruin to anyone who dared to enter. Rebecca dismissed it as superstition. To her, Blackthorne Manor was just another piece of history, one that begged to be uncovered. When the opportunity arose to spend a weekend at the manor for research purposes, she eagerly accepted. The drive to Blackthorne was long and eerie, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. As Rebecca approached the manor, the sky darkened, casting the old house in shadow. The building was even more imposing than she had imagined. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, its windows dark and hollow, like eyes staring out into the abyss. She parked her car and stood in front of the iron gates, which creaked open as if welcoming her. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, but shook off her unease. It was just an old house, she reminded herself. Nothing more. The interior of the manor was a maze of dark corridors and dusty rooms, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. The wallpaper had long since faded, and cobwebs hung from the ceilings like lace. Despite the disrepair, there was something regal about the place, a lingering trace of the grandeur it once held. Rebecca set up her equipment in the library where she had found the family records and journals left behind by the Blackthornes. She spent hours poring over the documents, fascinated by the details of their lives. The Blackthornes had been a wealthy family, but their rise to prominence had been swift and mysterious. Rumors of dark rituals and forbidden practices surrounded them, though nothing had ever been proven. As night fell, Rebecca lit the old candelabras she had found in the manor's kitchen. The flickering light cast long shadows across the room, making the place feel even more haunted. She could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. The sound echoed through the halls, giving the impression that the house itself was groaning. Then came the whispers. At first, Rebecca thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as she sat in the library, flipping through an old journal, she distinctly heard her name. Rebecca. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She stood up, looking around the room, but saw nothing. The air had grown colder, and she could feel a presence, as if someone was standing right behind her. Rebecca. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Rebecca's pulse quickened, and a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. She grabbed her flashlight and ventured into the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The shadows seemed to move with her, shifting and twisting as if alive. She followed the sound of the voice, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice led her to the grand staircase, its once beautiful banister now rotting and splintered. Rebecca hesitated at the foot of the stairs. The darkness above was thick, impenetrable, but the voice, soft and melodic, called to her from somewhere on the upper floor. Against her better judgment, she began to climb. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the silent manor. As she reached the top of the stairs, the temperature plummeted. She could see her breath in front of her, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something metallic. Blood? The voice grew louder, beckoning her toward a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. Rebecca's heart raced as she approached, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. Inside was a bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and a large mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed. In the center of the room stood a woman. Rebecca gasped, stumbling backward. The woman was pale, her skin nearly translucent, her long black hair hanging down to her waist. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her eyes dark and hollow, and her lips twisted into a sinister smile. "Rebecca," the woman whispered, her voice soft, but filled with malice. Rebecca tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She stepped back, her mind racing. Who was this woman? How did she know her name? "You've come to join us," the woman continued, her smile widening. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The woman moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Rebecca backed away until she hit the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman's face twisted into something inhuman, her eyes black and empty, her mouth opening wide to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. "You're one of us now!" the woman hissed. Suddenly, the mirror behind the woman cracked, and from its shattered surface, dozens of hands reached out, grasping at Rebecca. They pulled her toward the mirror, their cold, bony fingers digging into her skin. "No!" Rebecca screamed, struggling against their grip, but it was no use. The hands dragged her into the mirror, into the darkness beyond. And then there was silence. The next morning, when the village police arrived at Blackthorne Manor to investigate a break-in, they found no sign of Rebecca. Her car was still parked outside, her belongings scattered in the library. But Rebecca was gone, vanished without a trace. The mirror in the bedroom, however, remained intact, and if you look closely, you might see a face reflected in the glass, a face twisted in terror, forever trapped in the curse of Blackthorne Manor. Enoch Street was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to forget about the world. A quiet, narrow road, lined with old, weathered houses. It sat on the edge of town, forgotten by time. Few people ventured there, and fewer still talked about it. There were rumors, of course, stories of strange happenings, of people going missing in the dead of night, and of the shadows that seemed to come alive once the sun went down. Simon had heard the stories, but he didn't believe in them. He was a rational man, a private investigator by trade, here to look into the sudden disappearance of an elderly woman named Mrs. Cartwright. She had lived alone on Enoch Street, in the same house for over 50 years, until one night she vanished without a trace. The local authorities had found no signs of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Her neighbors said they hadn't seen her in days, but no one had heard anything unusual. They were used to keeping their distance. Mrs. Cartwright had been a reclusive woman, rarely seen outside of her home. Simon wasn't one to shy away from a mystery, and the case of Mrs. Cartwright intrigued him. He had been hired by her niece, a woman who lived across the country, to find out what had happened. But when he arrived at Enoch Street, the eerie silence of the place unsettled him. It was late afternoon when Simon arrived, the sky overcast and the air thick with the smell of rain. The houses on Enoch Street were old and tired, their windows dark and lifeless. There was something off about the place, something Simon couldn't quite put his finger on. He parked his car in front of Mrs. Cartwright's house, a small, dilapidated building with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he was immediately hit with the stench of mildew and decay. The inside of the house was dark, the air thick with dust. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years, despite Mrs. Cartwright having lived there until recently. Simon began his search, methodically checking each room for clues. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath his feet. There were no signs of a struggle, no personal belongings out of place, nothing to indicate that anything unusual had happened. As he made his way to the bedroom, Simon felt a chill run down his spine. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. He noticed something strange, shadows that didn't seem to belong. They flickered along the walls, moving even though there was no light to cast them. Simon's heart raced as he stepped closer to the bed. There, on the floor, was a single item, a book, its pages yellowed with age. He picked it up, flipping through the brittle pages. It appeared to be a journal, filled with scrawled handwriting that was barely legible. The entries were strange, rambling about shadows and voices in the dark. Mrs. Cartwright had written about seeing figures at the edge of her vision, shadows that moved on their own, whispering her name. The last entry was the most chilling. They've come for me. I can hear them outside the door. I don't know how much time I have left. The shadows are alive. They want me. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed through the house. Simon's heart jumped into his throat. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, growing darker, more distinct. He could feel something watching him, something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The thump came again, louder this time, from the hallway. Simon's breath quickened as he stepped out of the bedroom, his flashlight flickering. The shadows moved with him, twisting and writhing like living things. His hands trembled as he followed the sound, every instinct telling him to turn and leave, but something compelled him to press on. As he reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder still. The shadows converged, swirling together, forming a dark mass at the bottom of the stairs. Simon froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The darkness seemed to pulse, a low, guttural sound emanating from within. And then the shadows moved. They surged up the stairs, reaching for him with tendrils of darkness. Simon stumbled back, his flashlight flickering out. He fumbled in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel them, cold, suffocating, wrapping around him, pulling him down. Simon screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. They consumed him, dragging him into the dark. When the neighbors found Simon's car the next day, they assumed he had left. But inside Mrs. Cartwright's house, there was no sign of him. Only the journal, lying open on the floor, with a single new entry scrawled across the page. They've taken him. The shadows have taken him, just like they took me. The house on Enoch Street remains empty to this day, its windows dark and lifeless. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the whispers of those who have been lost to the shadows, calling out for someone to join them. They say you should trust your instincts, that little voice in your head that tells you when something's wrong. I ignored mine, and now I don't know how much time I have left. It started when I moved into this old house. I was desperate for a place of my own, something cheap and quiet, where I could write my book. The place had been on the market for years, and I was surprised it hadn't been snatched up sooner. Sure, it was a little run down, but it had charm. Exposed beams, creaky wooden floors, that kind of thing. Perfect for me, or so I thought. The first night, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, I assumed it was mice. I've lived in old houses before, and it's never anything more than a few pests. But this was different. The scratching wasn't random. It followed a pattern, almost like something was moving with intent. I tried to ignore it. That first week, I threw myself into my writing, staying up late into the night, drowning out the sound with music and coffee. But the scratching didn't stop. It got louder, more persistent. One night, as I sat at my desk trying to focus, the scratching was so loud I could feel it vibrating through the walls. I slammed my hands on the desk, frustrated. "Enough!" I yelled, knowing full well there was no one to hear me. But to my shock, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. I stood there, frozen, listening to the oppressive quiet of the house. Then I heard something else, a voice, whispering my name. I know what you're thinking. I was exhausted. My imagination was running wild. But I swear, it was real. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It came from within the walls. I backed away from the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I searched the room, my eyes darting to every corner, but of course, there was no one there. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering, soft, insistent, like a distant chant. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling me. The next morning, I decided to check the walls. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I needed to know. I started with the living room, tapping the walls, listening for anything unusual. Nothing. Then I moved to the bedroom. When I knocked on the wall behind my bed, the sound echoed. Hollow. There was something behind the wall. Grabbing a hammer, I pried away the wooden paneling. The boards came loose with a groan, revealing a small, dark space behind the wall. My heart was racing now. Adrenaline is surging through me. I reached inside, feeling around, expecting to find an old pipe, or maybe a nest of some sort. What I found was worse. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out and stared at it in disbelief. It was a door handle, rusted, ancient, but unmistakably a handle. My pulse quickened as I felt around for more. And soon, I uncovered the outline of a small door embedded in the wall. I yanked the door open, revealing a narrow passageway that disappeared into darkness. A foul, musty smell wafted out, making me gag. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the black void, my mind racing with questions. Who had built this? Where did it lead? Before I could stop myself, I grabbed a flashlight and crawled inside. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. The air was thick, suffocating, and the deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. I was shaking now, fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small room. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, a large, ornate mirror. I approached it slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it at the glass. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure in the mirror remained still, watching me. Then, slowly, its lips curled into a smile. I screamed and turned to run, but the passageway behind me had vanished. The walls were solid. I was trapped. The thing in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. I watched in horror as the glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The hand pushed through, followed by an arm, and then its head. I backed away, my mind screaming for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped out of the mirror, standing before me. It looked like me, but its eyes were wrong, black and empty, like a void that threatened to swallow me whole. It smiled again and whispered, "It's your turn." I've never been superstitious. Ghosts, demons, all that stuff. Just stories people tell to scare each other, right? At least, that's what I believed. But after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. I needed a place to stay after my divorce, and the rent was dirt cheap. The landlord said the house had been empty for years, and I could see why. It was ancient, with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and an attic that no one had bothered to clean out. The first few nights were uneventful, though the house had a way of making you feel like you weren't alone. I figured it was just my imagination. After all, I was living in a creaky old house. Strange noises were to be expected. But then, one night, I heard something strange coming from the attic. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping. I lay there for a moment, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Squirrels or raccoons sometimes got into old houses. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't random. It was as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth in the attic. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, or maybe the wind. I climbed the stairs to the attic, my footsteps echoing through the house. The attic door creaked as I opened it, and the thumping stopped. The silence was so sudden, it made my skin crawl. I shone the flashlight into the attic, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just old furniture, covered in dust, and a few cardboard boxes piled in the corner. I stood there for a moment, listening to the heavy silence. Nothing moved, no sounds, no thumping. I shook my head, feeling a bit foolish, and turned to go back downstairs. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help me. I froze. My skin prickled with fear. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the attic. Help me. I shone the flashlight toward the corner, my heart racing. There was nothing there. Just an old rocking chair, swaying gently back and forth. I hadn't noticed it before. The chair looked ancient, its wood worn and cracked with age. The whisper came again, louder this time. Help me. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of that attic, to leave the house and never come back. But I couldn't move. It was as if the voice had rooted me to the spot. Slowly, I approached the chair. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the back of the chair. It was cold. Ice cold. Suddenly, the chair stopped rocking. The whispering ceased, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and bony, grasped my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm away, stumbling backward. The chair began to rock violently, as if an invisible force was sitting in it, thrashing back and forth. The whispering returned, louder now, desperate. Help me, please. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the freezing night air. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with what I had just seen, what I had just felt. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. I slept in my car, too afraid to go anywhere near the house. The next day, I went back up to the attic, convinced that I had imagined the whole thing. But when I opened the door, the rocking chair was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. I moved out of the house a week later. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice, soft, pleading. Help me.